Kia ora Maui, kia ora tātou. It's a bit strange. Thanks for the invitation to speak, and I think it speaks volumes that we're here to talk about economy as guests of DOC and WWF. And I think it's a very, very interesting thing that we should all think about quite deeply. Something is definitely different. I have a lot of slides to get through, several of which I will fly right through because the groundwork has been done by other speakers. So I'll present you with a set of glimpses of some of the work that Sustainable Seas has been up to in the space that we've been talking about today. And I'll start with the take-home messages, and then we'll power through the slides. What we've been attuned to this morning, and I've got two very quick points to add to this, is that we're at a blue economy moment. People have started talking about blue economy 5 to 10 years ago, and that discourse has grown and shifted and moved and globalized. And so we're all sitting here talking about it, and we had a presentation from elsewhere in the world this morning. Taking advantage of this moment, I think that moment provides resources. It's a tool. It's a political tool for change. I think it's, but taking advantage of that will require rethinking economy and active transitioning, and we'll go through some of that shortly. It'll require us to do economy differently, all the way from investment to regulation. If economy is practice or stewardship and not just measures of output, as we tend to think of it as often, then really we need to be thinking right through. We need to be thinking about doing our regulation differently, doing our measures differently, doing our investment differently, and so forth. I think New Zealand is well resourced to do this, and I'll put a few slides to suggest that. And the main point of this talk is to show you, to introduce you to some of the ways that Sustainable Seas is actively engaged in this process. We saw this morning that this discourse is all over the place. It is a global moment, and it's much more than a thing. The notion of blue economy, I'm sure you've been introduced to this in lots of different ways, has been defined fundamentally differently from depending upon all of these major organizations around the world and small community organizations who are using the term. But the point I want to take from that is not that it's a fuzzy term, but that it's a political moment. That moment, I think, if you cross all of that work that's been done, I think what you can extract from that work is that there is a source of ecological concern around the oceans. For many, it's a crisis. For all, there is a source of ecological concern. The second point is that each of those reports, we've all come to see the oceans as central to humanity's needs and a source of economic opportunity at the same time. But that realizing those opportunities requires a number of things. It requires investment, science, new socio-ecological knowledge, new regulation. It also requires that we transition actively. It's not done by itself. And so those are, I think, are the key lessons from that particular moment. In Sustainable Seas, we've been using this language now for 5 years. And what we've tried to do in the first phase of our research is to turn that language into a platform for thinking beyond business as usual. We've also worked with EnviroStrat to think through the challenges of transitioning. We've worked with market economics to measure what we already have, and we've worked with various projects within the challenge. Whoops, okay, never mind. We've worked with various projects within the challenge to look at the regulatory value structure and so forth. What we found through that work is we found a whole set of what might be called blue economy stirrings, and Nigel made some references to some of these this morning. Those stirrings occurring in volume production with the big operators, and you can see some of the slides around there, sets of promises being made, some altered measurement of bottom lines, some commitments to certification programs, et cetera, et cetera. But we've also seen stirrings of it in terms of multiple small-scale initiatives in ecotourism and seafood and seaweed. You know, Agri-Sea comes to mind as an obvious example. We've seen blue tech initiatives. We've seen the rise of interest in impact investment, and we've seen a turn to investment in Māori economy from the hapu whānau level all the way up to iwi level. So, and Māori have, what we learned in phase one of Māori organisations, Māori entities have generally taken a lead in much of this thinking. We've also learnt through phase one that it's very difficult to capture all of this through existing measures, and people from Stats this morning took us through some of the reasons why that is hard. So in one of our first phase projects, we thought through how can we capture some of this emerging blue economy in different ways. We produced this kind of map rather than using sectors and established measures. We went out, wandered around the country, recorded some, not all of them are represented up there. I've even put Envirostrat in there as an organisation that's operating in a blue economy. Sorry, Catherine, I didn't manage to get Te Ramoana in there as another entity that's operating in that way. But what it does is it changes things from that previous graph. We think about things differently, and we might cluster those kinds of activities up there, and we might be able to be put in our imagination of what an economy is. We might be able to put the commodity economy, the fast-moving consumer goods, the large-scale outputs that we're used to counting and that dominate all the measures, into some kind of relativity with other kinds of activities. We also recognize that that kind of economic activity is not exactly the way in which we would normally describe economic activity. The mussel reef restoration projects, the creation of spatial management plans and policies, and so on. We don't normally understand those as economic, yet they are. They are about stewarding resources and organizing those resources to deliver livelihoods. And so you can then maybe put all of these kinds of entities and actors who are economic actors. They perform in the economy. You might put them onto a grid of where they're related to each other in terms of whether they're more market-oriented, more government-oriented, more place-based kind of regulatory-oriented. And as we heard this morning, one should really, in the New Zealand context, which gives us our unique advantage, stick to Tiriti in the middle, because we now have a fund. Now that begins to give you a very different resource for thinking about blue economy futures. We also went through a process of trying to distill the findings from the first phase into a set of material resources, which are represented there on the left, and a set of transition possibilities that might emerge from those. And so, struggling to read this with the material coming that way. So we might argue then that New Zealand enterprises are embracing blue economy ideas. That represents a resource. Apologies. They have aspirations and commitments, a resource. Government agencies are committing to participatory and EBM applications. That's a resource for doing economy differently. There are opportunities to create blue economy value. So there are new kinds of investments in new technologies, explorations of different kinds of economic value that might be produced, different kinds of business possibilities. People are active in doing that. And Māori economy is leading the way. What that gives us, I think, is a series of transition possibilities as we think into that sense of needing to actively transition. We can embrace this different understanding of the economy. Better framed, it might give us better framed objects of management. Why do we produce those measures of sectors and so on? That produces us objects of economic management. We can produce different objects of management, and then we can do things differently. We can recalibrate policy and investment. We might be able to manage to facilitate transitions. And And the challenge is heavily invested in the concept of ecosystem-based management as one way of being able to do that. We might want to transition to different regulatory models. And I'll just put up in a second what we consider to be a blue economy development model for the New Zealand context. So that's the kind of model that we can begin to understand. It doesn't strip out scale and commodity production entirely from our thinking about what the future might be in a blue economy. As Maui has outlined for us, whakatohea are trying to build those kinds of larger scale production processes into an EBM, a community-based conception, a collective return conception of what economy might be. We might then center indigenizing blue economy as a set of practices that guide the way it is that we steward our marine resources. And that starts to be, I know it's a bit open and a bit conceptual, but it starts to reframe the way we might think about economic development in ways other than growth. We also might start thinking about what kind of institutional framework, regulatory framework is necessary to achieve this. So we might consider shifting from an RMA world, not necessarily in the RMA that's designed or legislated for, but the RMA that's actually practiced. And we might want to shift from that world into a place-oriented and practice-based, opportunities-focused EBM. Some outlines of that, some outlines of what that might look like have been given to us by the Sea Change process, by Te Korowai in Kaikoura, and so on. So there are some models as to how we might do place-based, opportunities-focused development differently at a community kind of way. And that's really giving teeth to the notion of just transitions, as opposed to treating just transitions as a series of carbon measures or something like that. So it's adding teeth to just transitions. We might then be able to go from, I can't remember who it was talking about it before, from trade-offs to a world of gifts and gains. So a world where we're actually investing collectively and we can accept that collective kind of gain. So the core projects, what are blue, let me go back one. What is it that, no, I won't do that. What is it that Sustainable Seas is doing about this? Well, we have in phase 2 of our research, we've commissioned 4 major core projects, one of which is led by Nigel and Drew, and I've dropped, for the second time today, dropped on Drew the responsibility to tell you what this project is about. But it's really about, so the idea is it's a restorative economies-based blue economy project. We have an indigenizing blue economy in Aotearoa project, which is asking the questions of what does it mean to indigenize New Zealand's blue economy? What does it look like? How can that be achieved? What kinds of institutions, processes, practices are necessary to actually put the treaty at the center of that regulatory order and to actually do blue economy differently in that way? We've got a project on growing tourism in a blue economy. What would marine ecotourism led economic futures look like in New Zealand? And then we have a project that explicitly confronts that issue of scale and growth. How can we produce a new sector in an old kind of, in a more conventional set of understandings as to what a sector is? How can we produce one of those sectors more or less from scratch within an EBM? So what kind of knowledge is necessary? What kinds of commitments need to be made by investors? What kinds of products ought to be derived? What kinds of seaweeds? How can we do that from scratch? So I'm quite proud of that suite of projects, but we can carry on. And we also have a set of what we've called the Innovation Fund projects, which are a set of smaller projects explicitly designed to focus on what people have said, tools and activity, and actually what it takes to bring these kinds of economies about. And we could probably divide those into 3 kinds of groups. There are 2 projects which are explicitly Mātauranga Māori focused, utilizing traditional forms of practice to innovate in a wider sense within wider economies as well as within community economies. We have a set of projects focused explicitly on aquaculture. Again, some of those projects are bringing Mātauranga Māori ideas to bear. And then we have a set of 3 projects that you might imagine to be the major innovation kind of areas that we might think about in a more traditional, conventional kind of way. So we have some blue tech, we have some looking at innovations in fisheries and how we can do fishing differently, benthic protection practices and so forth. So that's what Sustainable Seas is trying to do to bring this blue economy about. And those are the same slide that you got at the start. So thank you.
Thank you very much.